Well, thanks everybody for coming. And so I work with the Xerces Society, and I also work with the USDA NRCS. And that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service. It used to be the Soil Conservation Service. And so we promote diversity on farms for pollinators, but that's also good for other insects that are beneficial for farming. And I'm an ecologist, so the idea of a beneficial insect is kind of an oxymoron because everything has a role in nature, but we use that concept of beneficial to refer to pollinators and predators and parasitoids, so what we call natural enemies of pests in farms. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. But thanks so much for coming today and for listening online later. And so the Xerces Society, we take our name from the Xerces blue butterfly. It was the first butterfly in the US to go extinct that we know of due to habitat loss. And that's it up there. And we do lots of different work, but our biggest program is pollinator conservation and agricultural biodiversity. But we do work with endangered species such as the rusty patch bumblebee and the monarch butterfly. And we also work with aquatics. And normally I like to bring a book about mosquito management because that's kind of a big issue. And so we have a really nice community guide and a larger manual on our website. And so at the end of this program, besides this being available online through Living Web Farms, I'll also post it on a website, and I have it in the outline. And because of going out in the field today, what I'll try to do is label all of the photos that we have. So if you have photos you'd like to share, if you could send them to me. And then once everything is posted on the website, we'll send a link out. You could check beforehand because I made a tiny URL. And so you'll see that in a sec. But through NRCS, we do a lot of work, and we've compiled all of the pollinator-related documents from NRCS at this website. And in any case, so you'll have a chance to have a copy of these slides if you want them. And so here's the tiny URL. It's just a tinyurl.com, Pollinators Living Web Farms. And they'll probably post everything on your website as well. Yeah, thanks a lot. So the honeybee decline actually really raised awareness about problems for a lot of other insects and pollinators. And as well as the monarch decline has really raised awareness about the need to protect habitat and change the way we manage farms. So about 90% of wild plants actually depend on pollinators for reproduction. And so we tend to think of pollinators as important for our food, which is true, but they're even more important for our natural ecosystems and helping grow trees and keep our water clean and provide oxygen for us. So they're the ones that keep everything going. And this report came out in 2016 from the UN, and they found that about 16% of vertebrate pollinators are in decline. So that would be, what vertebrate pollinators do we have here in the East?
Birds.
Birds, that's right, yeah. And I understand that bats are our bats are, just by accident, might do some pollination, but we don't have any fruit bats around here. But 40% of pollinator species are in decline, invertebrate pollinator species around the world. And this one, I like to talk about this St. Francis satyr because later on we're going to be talking about disturbance and pollinators and predatory insects all depend on habitat. All wildlife needs food and shelter and protection from disturbance. And so if you do have land on your farm, you always want to have some areas that are undisturbed. But a lot of especially meadow habitat really depends on disturbance. So historically, we used to have a lot more fire, and we also had big grazers. We had bison and things like that that would come through and totally eat everything and change the habitat around them. And so the St. Francis satyr is actually found at Fort Bragg. And there, a lot of our military installments where they're testing munitions are actually really good habitat for a lot of our rare species because there's kind of random disturbance that's caused by fire. So when a fire goes through naturally, it leaves patches, And so, and it rejuvenates a lot of the understory. And so it's kind of an interesting, that's one of the places where you find that rare butterfly in North Carolina. So this is something I'll talk a little bit more. I mentioned Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home. But birds not only depend on the fruits and things that insects pollinate. So this is beautyberry, and that's a wonderful bee plant. And birds eat those seeds. But most birds, about 90%, feed caterpillars to their young. And if you ever do have a chance to see Doug, he talks about all the different vitamins in different kinds of caterpillars that birds are getting through those soft-bodied things that make great food for young birds because they can gently go down their throat. And then this study just came out in Germany, and I know a lot of people, if you remember when you were little, you used to have to clean off your windshield because they'd be covered in dead insects, especially certain places. But more and more, you can go for a whole year maybe without seeing any insects, which is a really bad sign because insects are the bottom of our food web. They're part of the most important part of our food webs. And so in Germany, they actually had this tremendous decline. And we haven't done any similar studies here that I know of. So pollinator, I've talked about this, the food that they provide in terms of seeds. Bears actually, when they're going for honeybee colonies, they're not really interested in honey, they're interested in the larvae because they're so full of protein. They're really super nutritious. And there's the book that I mentioned. So one of the things that Doug Tallamy talks about is he has photographed little chickadees collecting caterpillars. He says for one clutch of chickadees, that, they're probably one of our smallest birds, they need between 5,000 and 6,000 caterpillars to raise a clutch. And birds and bees are what are called central place foragers. So that means they have one nest, and they go out from that site to collect their food for their young. And so the farther they have to go, the more energy that takes, and the less successful they'll be. So if you want to have birds, if you want to have chickadees, there have to be caterpillars. And the work that he did was look at native plants in the same genus as some introduced plants. So Hamamelis from Asia versus Hamamelis from here. How many caterpillars did they find on those plants? And he found a tremendous difference between the introduced species and our native species. And there's lots of relationships that we don't understand. So it's kind of a conservative approach to use natives. And there's lots of non-natives, especially if you're a farmer, you're using a lot of non-natives to grow that are great for bees. Xerces really just discourages people from using what's called an invasive plant. And in North Carolina, you can find a list of invasive species on the North Carolina Native Plant Society webpage. And that was put together by a group of wildlife biologists. And that's changing over time, especially as our climate changes. And so Doug Tallamy has a great saying. People are always, well, if I see holes on my plant, he says, I forget what he calls it, but the 8-foot test. He says, just step away 8 feet. Do you see those anymore? And you don't. It's not a problem. And can you all see the caterpillar on that euphorbia? Yeah. Do you see it? Well, good for you. Yeah. So they're pretty cryptic. They're hiding from the birds because the birds want to collect them and eat them. Or the wasps that we saw, or a predatory bug. Lots of things are going for those caterpillars because they're very nutritious. And so here you can see our thrush with a caterpillar in her mouth, and things like squirrels as well. Our fox squirrel depends on a lot of insects for its life. And so I put up the Audubon.org. They now have a list that they developed of native plants. You can put in your zip code to get a list for your region. Then the National Wildlife Federation also has a list. One of those is based on Doug Tallamy's work, but they're both terrific if anybody needs help finding plant information. So I went to a workshop this year with the Wildlife Society, and one of the people was doing acoustic studies of frogs and things, and they were comparing open canopied areas and non-open canopied areas. And I said, well, why would that matter for a frog or a toad? And he said, well, there's more floral diversity in the understory in the open canopy, and they also depend on the insects on the plants for their food. So it's really important. And of course, these anoles are out in dry uplands, but it was a really good reminder of how everybody. And this particular little insect, you can find 10,000 of them in 1 square meter of soil. It's a springtail, and it's not technically an insect, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So all the things that we're talking about today are in the Arthropoda, the phylum Arthropoda, but they're not all technically insects. But when I talk about insects today, I really just mean everything that's in the phylum Arthropoda. It's just easier. So technically, insects have a head and a thorax and an abdomen and 6 legs when they're adults. But so these are related to insects somewhat. But they're a sign of soil pollution. So if they're there, then that's a healthy soil. And so there's a lot of insects that are in the soil eating these springtails. And so when we're talking about soil health, that also is affecting our plant health, but it's also affecting all of the biodiversity around us. So just want to talk, Brannen's going to talk a little bit more about bees today, but I'd just like to talk a little bit about cross-pollination, and squash is a really neat one because there's actually the male flower that is covered in pollen. This is all covered in pollen, and she's getting covered. And at the base are nectaries, where they're attracting insects with the nectar. And then the female flower is a big receptive area that's kind of sticky, but there's also nectaries at the bottom of that flower. And so in order for us to have squash fruit, you have to have somebody carry the pollen from this flower to that flower. And so it's a really good example. A lot of flowers actually have both parts together, and that's called a perfect flower. And so even those flowers, if they get pollen from a different plant, that is going to be called cross-pollination, and that means they're getting pollen from somewhere else, and that produces oftentimes healthier, bigger fruit with more seeds than one that came from its own plant, And so a lot of plants have actually mechanisms to avoid getting the pollen from their own plant. So if you know our wild geranium, it has the female parts and the male parts, but they mature at different times, so that one flower would get pollen from a different geranium. So, so here's what I was talking about. So today I'll be talking about insects, but I really mean all the arthropods. And then, so we talked about insect predators. There's a huge diversity: beetles and bugs and flies, lacewings, and social and solitary wasps, and then a lot of parasitoid insects. And so we use the term parasitoid to mean it's a kind of parasite, but if we have a parasite, like if you had a tapeworm or something, you may or may not notice. It might not affect you unless you were really sick to begin with. You might not ever know, and they tend to be much smaller than us. But a parasitoid is often the same size as its host, and it usually kills its host. So what we saw today, like that bean beetle, and it becomes the pupae for its host. And then non-insects would be spiders and harvestmen. That's another word for daddy long-leg, and centipedes and pseudoscorpions and nematodes. And a lot of greenhouses actually use nematodes to control pests in the soil. And then there's actually entomopathic fungi, and I know there's a lot of excitement about that. I tend to worry about that because those can affect bees as well. Oh, I just wanted to say, does anybody see the brown lacewing on there? I just thought it was so interesting. It picked that plant to be on because it sort of blends in. Do you see it? So beneficial insects, I've already talked about that concept. It's an oxymoron for an ecologist, but we use the words. There's no good way to talk about it, is there? It's really hard.
The problem is all the insects are beneficial.
Right.
We categorize and we shouldn't.
Exactly, right. But so in terms of agriculture, we say natural enemies. So what that means is that certain insects tend to prey on other insects. So it's its enemy in nature. And then biocontrol agents. And I always like that one. That sounds like a James Bond something. So yeah, so they support our ecosystems and they help regulate insect pests. So they basically just keep things in balance. And so the more diversity we have, the more insect diversity, the more plant diversity we have, the more insect and other arthropod diversity we have, then the less chance there's going to be a pest outbreak. So I just want to just give a basic little, so there's two kinds of main insect groups that some go through complete metamorphosis. So you think of a butterfly has an egg, and then it has a caterpillar stage, and then it goes into a chrysalis, and that's its pupal stage, and it transforms, it totally melts and becomes an adult with wings, and it can fly, and it can reproduce. And then other insects go through, oops, I did the backwards. This is the incomplete one. So here's the complete metamorphosis. And so that's what we see with the lady beetle. She has eggs. There it is. There's the other golden eggs.
Okay, that was
yep. Okay. So these aren't as metallic looking as the squash ones. And,
indeed, the ladybug and the bean beetle eggs look very similar.
Yeah.
The difference is the ladybugs are usually more scattered. That's a pretty tight cluster.
Yeah.
Because they're usually like thinking about prey while they're laying eggs, whereas the bean beetle is feeding in one place.
Right.
It kind of seals off a piece of the leaf so the plant can't defend itself.
Yeah.
And so their eggs are usually much tighter.
Yeah. And so this is actually the pupae of the ladybug. And this is not a very good picture of the larva. So, but we'll, yeah. So this is actually from a book that I wanted to show you guys. And so this is free online. It's called Habitat Planning for Beneficial Insects. And so a lot of the pictures from my talk today will actually come from here. And what's nice about this is in the back, it has a whole section on each group. And what I really like about this is there's a little bar at the top that shows you the size range. Because, you know, when we have a picture, we want to show it as big as we can. But some of these are really, really, really tiny, like that mirrored bug we saw today. And so this is good to be able to look and see what size you're looking for. And then this is also really neat. It has a whole page on the ladybugs. So it has our native and non-native species. And then it also has a whole section at the back about plants that are good for habitat. And then especially it has a whole section on cover crops, which I really like. So it's a really nice little guide you guys can grab. And so it has this chart and information in it. So we talk about predators. And so a lot of our predators are actually what we call generalist predators. So that's like when we think about Japanese beetles, they'll eat basically anything, even if they have some preferences. But a lot of our predators are generalists. And here's the one we saw today, right? You guys remember the name? And then this is a predatory stink bug. And so if you were able to compare this stink bug, her mouth parts, with a pest stink bug, they're going to be much skinnier and longer on the pest and a little thicker on the predatory stink bug. So, and then we have ambush bugs, and I thought we might see some ambush bugs out there because that's what I see a lot when I'm out hiking. So if you find, they're called ambush bugs, they're really tiny, but they're very powerful. They have those really strong arms just like a praying mantis. And can you see that? That's a pycnanthemum, and that's the little ambush bug hiding in there. So they hide out just like some of our little crab spiders in the flowers. And they grab, and they come in different colors. And then these are assassin bugs, and they go through gradual metamorphosis. So that's the nymph. So a lot of times if you see something, you might think this is a pest. And so a lot of our pests look just like our prey species. So if the pests, what we call pests, are there, so I like to think of them as prey. If there's prey, there's going to be predators. And just like wolves and rabbits, if you get rid of all your wolves and rabbits, who's going to return quicker? That's when you get pest outbreaks, because you've taken away all your predators. And so that's what's really important, to keep diverse habitat, to have a home for all of your insects. And then true bugs, these can be pretty small and they're very fast. This is one I find in my garden a lot. It's an ant mimic. So it looks like an ant, but it's actually a damsel bug. I'm just going to go through these really quickly, so we'll have time for everybody later. But these are ones that we probably could have found, and I have some scouting sheets. Well, anyway, I'll post them. We have a bunch of scouting sheets on the Xerces website. There's some for doing testing in the soil. You can put a little bowl in the ground overnight and see who comes in that. Or you can use a piece of paper and bang like grass on it, and sometimes you'll get these little tiny things like the minute pirate bug and the big-eyed bugs. And the big-eyed bugs are actually pretty easy to recognize when you see one, but you know, they're very tiny. They're going to be this big. And the minute pirate bugs are even smaller than that, so they're very hard to see, but you can kind of recognize them. And then mantids, people always think of them as good. A lot of times people will buy these through like an organic gardening catalog, but that tends to be I think it's always a Chinese mantid, and that actually eats our native mantid. And then there's no regulation of that, just like our ladybugs as well. People will buy ladybugs. It tends to be an introduced species. We don't know what kind of diseases they might be carrying. And so we kind of discourage that. Even though, you know, people think they're doing good, it's better to create the habitat. If you have the habitat, you always have some prey for them in your little messy grass area that you put a sign up that says pollinator or insect habitat or your diverse hedgerow. And so these sometimes actually eat, especially the Chinese ones, can even eat hummingbirds. So here's a little lacewing. And how many of you have seen the green lacewing? They're just beautiful. The brown lacewing, I understand, tends to fly more at night, so that's why we don't really see it. But this is the sign that the lacewings are around. They have a little stalk, and those are the eggs right on top. Oh yeah, we saved that one. Yeah. What do we do with that? I know. So this is a really funny one. I was out at a beautiful natural area that they had smooth coneflower, and I saw this little piece of cotton moving around on the coneflower head, and I looked up close, and there, can you see the little head sticking out? There's the little mouth parts. Can you see it? And there she extended herself a little bit more. But I thought that was so cool. I wondered if not only camouflage, but it was out in the hot sun. I wondered if she picked white to help deflect the heat. So, and there's the lady beetle larva. So a lot of times people don't understand that that's actually, these larvae can be even better predators than the adult ladybug. So especially on aphids. And here is our aphid mummy. So do you see what that looks like? So if you see that mummy, that means there's a parasitoid wasp that laid her egg in there. And so sometimes you'll see a little hole, and that means that wasp pupated and became an adult and emerged and is going around laying her eggs elsewhere. And then a lot of times people don't realize that fireflies are important predators as well, but especially their larvae in the soil. They prey on snails and slugs and caterpillars. So yeah, and the soldier beetles as well. And sometimes I actually see these not just in the ground, so they can be up in fruit sometimes, yeah.
But in the ground, they're pretty major for controlling cucumber beetles. Corn rootworm is now.
Oh, okay, yeah. Great. Yeah, please chime in, because you know a lot more about some of the benefits in the garden. So, and then the ground beetles, these are important predators. This is a really fast-moving predator. How many of you have seen the tiger beetles out in the wild? Yeah. But some of them are more active at night, so we don't see them that much unless we're digging in the soil. Sometimes they get uncovered. But they're actually really important also for eating weed seeds. So sometimes, I don't know if I kept a picture of a beetle bank, but that's something that's discussed in this habitat planning guide. So a beetle bank, in Europe, they would take twigs and things and cover it with soil, and it makes kind of a ridge. And then if you just cover that in grasses, then that's called a beetle bank. But just simply leaving unmown grasses, particularly some of our native bunch grasses, any grass, they tend to nest right at the surface. And so when we talk about tillage and bees, I don't know if Brannen's going to talk about that, but some of our ground nesting bees are sensitive to tillage. But if you can just do surface tining for a bee, then the nests underground aren't disturbed that much. But for ground nesting beetles, even a little bit of tillage is going to destroy their nests. But they can often tumble out of that disturbance and travel. They can move, but if it's a sunny, hot day, then they're going to have a harder time. So if you can leave strips of unmown area or leave strips of cover crops, then at least there's some refuge in between the areas where you're tilling on your farm, or in your garden, sorry. And so here's the syrphid fly. Did everybody get a chance to see the adult syrphid fly? These are bee mimics, so they look like little flies. There's actually a bunch of famous books that have about bees that have syrphid flies on the cover. And if you visit the North Carolina Zoo, their bee display is full of syrphid flies instead of bees. So, but their larvae, look at this larvae, is smaller than the aphid it's eating. Can you guys tell? This is the aphid and that's the syrphid fly larva. So I've never actually found one myself. So if we're out today and anybody sees this little tiny thing, that's probably a syrphid fly. You've seen them, huh?
Well, and I've got some pictures we'll show. Okay, they can be bigger than the aphids too, by the way. They vary in size, they vary in color.
Yeah, we have another,
ones.
I've seen pictures where it's much bigger than that.
Yeah. But I mean, any place you have a lot of aphids, the odds are good that you'll see one. They're out there.
Yeah.
I think you might have a pupa in that picture we took yesterday.
Oh, great. Okay, right, that's right. So I should pull that up. Yeah. So this little one is probably the most common one that you'll see, but we also saw, did anyone see the much bigger? There's a huge diversity of syrphid flies. And in Europe, when they do pollinator studies, they also monitor our syrphid flies because they're active in cooler, wetter weather. And if you have, how many of you try to photograph pollinators of our spring ephemeral wildflowers? Oftentimes it's a little tiny gnat or a fly that's pollinating because they somehow are more active in those earlier, cooler, wetter conditions.
We have that warm spell here in February.
Uh-huh.
Syrphid flies are out.
Yeah, interesting, yeah. So predatory wasps, and this is a scoliid wasp, and these are males. The males don't have any place to nest, and so they sometimes congregate together, and this was at a sod farm. And so the females, they lay their eggs in grubs, and so Japanese beetles and some other grubs eat the roots of grasses. So it was a perfect habitat. The farm decided to do some farmscaping. They just simply stopped mowing up to their creek. There was a little creek that ran through. This habitat was totally covered in these wonderful scoliid wasps. Now these are solitary wasps, and I don't know if Brannen's going to talk more. I'll be talking a little bit more about that. But here is that spider wasp. So this is one of the mud daubers that I find nesting when I put out the bamboo. And they're just beautiful. They tend to be a little shy. So if you get up close to the bamboo, they might wait for you to move away. And this is a braconid, and can you see she's carrying a caterpillar? She's going to take that caterpillar back to her nest and lay an egg on it. She'll seal that cell off. She'll never see her young. And it'll hatch out, and it'll live most of its life underground or wherever its nest is in a cavity. And then it'll emerge as an adult next year. It'll go through pupation. So they go through 4 or 5 instars just like caterpillars. And because they're solitary, they don't have anything to defend. So social wasps and social bees, like honeybees and yellow jackets, they have a nest, they have a queen, and so if somebody gets too close to their nest, then they have young and larvae and food and provisions that they're protecting, and that's why they can be defensive. But a solitary wasp or a solitary bee, if you get close to their nest, if they defended it, that would be it. Nobody would take over care. They don't have a queen. They're never going to see their young, so they're never defensive.
And these guys here, the males, you can walk up to a massive amount of amaranth or lamb's quarters and brush it, and they just kind of buzz up into the air, and there's this gentle buzzing, and then they settle back down again.
Yeah.
And they're just like you just banged into like maybe 20 or 30, there's no need to sting you.
And males don't even have stingers, so you don't have to worry doubly. So here's some of the little eggs that, so here you can see this one is going to be a wasp coming out. And I think these are the parasitized ones, and these are unparasitized, the ones that aren't. I'm pretty sure. And so one of the books that I thought I had, but I couldn't find, but Pat brought his, is this garden insects book. And nowadays you can go online and pretty much, if you describe the insect and put it in Google and look at images, you can probably find an image, or you can post to iNaturalist or Bug Guide. But this is a terrific reference if you want to see pretty much all the common critters, and they have all the life stages. It's a really great reference book. So here's that tomato hornworm, and there's the mummies again. And here is the wasp that lays her eggs in there. Can you guys see? So she'd be pretty hard to find out. Debbie Roos took this picture. How many of you are on the Growing Small Farms web? Yeah, so she's an amazing photographer. And here is the leaf-footed bug. And can you see the little tiny egg there on her neck? So that is a tachinid fly. I'm not sure if it's this one, but these are also tachinid fly eggs on the gypsy moth. And so this was from down in Alabama, Ayanaba Majumdar in Alabama at the University of, I guess he's at Auburn. He's in Extension, yeah. Huh?
Dr. A.
Yeah, Dr. A, right. So he uses what are called trap crops around, he has tomatoes and also squash. He'll plant sunflowers and some grasses. Sudex is what it's called. And so these leaf-footed bugs tend to be attracted to the sunflowers and the grasses, and then the tachinid flies can come in and lay their eggs on the. He says for that particular system, they don't parasitize them fast enough, so it doesn't quite work. But if you set up a trap crop, if it's tall enough, sometimes just that barrier around the plants will actually stop them, you know, because insects are pretty small. That's as far as they go, and then you'll have less pest species in your crops itself.
If you don't think in terms of immediate outcomes, you're going to do a whole lot better with all this, because indeed, the conid wasp, it does not kill that larva for quite a while, and while it's not killing it, it's eating 25% more to support the conid wasp. So it can be doing more damage. And there, I don't know about the tachinid fly that attacks the bugs, but the one that attacks the cabbage worm, it basically gets in late enough and doesn't kill it quick enough that it has any impact on that crop. But what it's doing in both situations is suppressing the overall populations of the pests.
Right.
So if you take the long view, you have balance. If you're looking for a mechanistic control or treatment of one immediate problem, it doesn't work. But if you look at the big picture,
But it's going to show up further next go round.
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. You don't get it the way you expect it. You have to accept it the way nature makes it work.
Mm-hmm. So it's not like going out in spring to kill the bugs that are eating your thing right now. That kills them, and you get this crop, but then maybe have more problems further down the road.
Almost for certain have more problems later.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the other things is actually when insects eat plants, sometimes that actually stimulates more production. So, that's also something that we don't always think about, but particularly in really valuable crops like soybean, they've looked at that. And so they've come up with what are called economic thresholds to understand if it's over a certain amount of damage, it actually reduces production. But it can be like 30 or 40% leaf eaten, and it won't really affect the production of the plant. So that's the other thing, that sometimes we assume that any hole in the plant is bad, but it might actually increase your production.
And yet that's really hard to get people. I mean, I was presenting at a broccoli workshop, and I was saying that, and you know, extension was just really hard for me to tell people to let 40% of their foliage get eaten.
Right. Yeah.
But I've done it, and the production was spectacular.
Yeah.
You know, and the other piece to know is that you have that predation on the plant's going to try and defend itself, and what it makes is antioxidants.
Yes.
So you actually have greater nutrition in the plants that have been attacked by insects than you have in the plants that you coddle.
Right. And I think a lot of people are familiar with some of the forestry systems, and you guys might, the foresters with us might be more familiar. But some trees, when they're attacked by an insect, they give off different pheromones to say, hey, there's these insects around here. And so that also affects the other plants in the area. And they're looking more about that within vegetable systems. We haven't looked at it as much in vegetables, but I think that's some of the new research that's happening. So spiders are generalist predators, so they don't recognize a good bug from a bad bug. So there's one of our Agapostemon bees. And this is in sourwood. How many have ever looked at the little sourwood flowers close up? But those are actually in the heath family, the same family as blueberry and cranberry and huckleberry. And there's the little eyes we were trying to show you. Who was it? We couldn't see it earlier. Do you see there's 2 eyes and then there's 4 more little eyes down there? That's one of our jumping spiders. So we have a huge diversity of pollinators, bees and wasps, flies, butterflies, moths. I think moths have gotten a little bit more recognition as pollinators, especially as we're seeing a lot more of the work with too much light at nighttime, confusing things. So people have been doing some more work on moths to understand effects. And in the process have learned that they're probably more important pollinators than we realize, and particularly in the wild, but also for crops. And beetles as well, and there's other pollinators as well. So they all need food and shelter and water and protection from pesticides or disturbance. But as I said before, in nature, we had a lot of fire in our landscape historically, and especially for some of our rare species, we've discovered that part of the reason they're rare is because we've suppressed fire so much. And then just other kinds of disturbance have been, in the past, bison, but also a tree falling is a kind of disturbance, and flooding along scours, along river scours. Some of our species depend on everything being cleared out to be competitive. And so bees are what we consider our most important pollinators in agriculture, because they actually evolved to eat on pollen and nectar for all of their stages beyond the egg. So other things like wasps and flies, they may need nectar and pollen as adults, but they generally feed insects or eat dung or detritus or something else at other stages. And then NRCS has a bunch of neat resources. The plants database, I don't know if everybody knows, but the plants database, you can actually go in and you can select a list of, you can get a list of plants just for your county. You can, so you can download, you can go in and select which information you want, family or common name, scientific name. It's a really cool database. And so lots of other information. And so we have a huge bee diversity here in the US, about 500, probably more than 500. When I was in Virginia, we had a little less than 500 species, and they started doing research, and I think they're close to 600 now, just in a short time. And so we just haven't done a lot of field research, and so now we're starting to do more. And I'm going to talk a little bit about iNaturalist, but a lot of citizens are helping to increase our understanding of the biodiversity. So the vast majority of our bees and wasps are actually solitary. And I've kind of talked about that a little bit. And I'm just going to grab one of the things that I like to promote pollinator habitat in schools and in communities. And nowadays, there's just so much fear of stings, and also for allergies. And so in terms of stings, any bee or wasp, if it's on a flower and you walk up to it, it's going to fly away. You know, they don't have anything to defend. They're just interested in nectar and pollen, and they're scared of you. If it's a solitary bee or wasp and you're near its nest, like the ones that we saw that Brannen has, and then if you put out bamboo, these are kind of a little bit too long. Probably a little bit shorter is good. I've been opening some of these at the end of the season. You can crack them open from the back and then see what's in there. But these nests, if you get really close, I like to have them right by my door because it's really fun to see who comes to visit. And you want to have all different sizes. So the smallest sweat bee that you've ever had on your arm, it can be that narrow an opening to about a pencil size is the largest one. If you go to Costco right now, they're selling those bee houses. Some of the openings are a little too big. Maybe sometimes bees can put more than one cell in that space, but usually about pencil size is the biggest size you need. But the solitary, the social bees and wasps, if you put out it's called a wasp deterrent nest. These actually deter social wasps from nesting near you. So the social wasps are also predators, so they're really great. But what happens is a single mom will come looking in spring in probably February or March. And if she sees that there's already a wasp nest there, she says, gee, there's not going to be enough food in this neighborhood for me and my family. I need to go move someplace else. And so she'll nest elsewhere. And so it's a really simple deterrent. I had it at my community garden. We had a little shed. It was a wonderful place for some of the paper wasps. And every couple weeks I'd be knocking out the poor mom's nest. And then I put one of these up. It's been in there for 4 years. We haven't had any. So it just needs to be under something so it won't get wet. And they're like 2 for $10. So really easy thing to do.